This is a case that changed the country of Chile forever. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Francesca and I'm true crime obsessed. So if you're obsessed with true crime like I am, I'm here for you every week with a new true crime story. Today's drink of choice is an English toffee almond milk latte. So it's time to sip and dip into some true crime. Now let's get into the story. Today we're talking about the case of Daniel Zamudio. Daniel was born in San Bernardo, Chile on August 3rd, 1987. He was born into a family of 6, so he lived with his mother, his father, his 2 siblings, Jacqueline and Ivan. And Jacqueline was younger than Daniel, Ivan was older, so he was right smack in the middle. Daniel grew up a very happy boy and he loved to play outside, he loved to cook. He also really loved music, so he would listen to a lot of pop songs like Britney Spears, or there were a lot of bands in Chile that he would listen to as well. Daniel grew up kind of quote unquote in a feminine manner. He would love to get his nails painted. He would love to watch his mom do her makeup. He was really into fashion and fashion statements, and he loved everything girly, kind of like pop. So when Daniel was growing up, his family actually suspected him to be gay, but he would always deny it until he turned 17. And I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but he was almost done with high school at the age of 17, so maybe he felt like a little bit better about coming out. Daniel comes out to his family, and the family took it pretty well. They already had their suspicions about him, so they kind of took it like, yeah, we kind of knew already. I didn't really see anything negative about how his family and friends took his coming out. The only thing that they said that Daniel was a really great person. So he was actually working as a salesman in a clothing store in Providencia, and it's a little island in Chile. So he would have to commute there, and he would mostly just work weekends. So he was traveling back and forth trying to save up money because his actual dream was to become a model. He didn't really tell his family this at the time, but that was his dream. That was what he was working towards. So he was saving up his money by working in retail. At this time, Chile was not a country that was very accepting of the LGBTQ plus community. They would really discriminate against this population. So for Daniel to be so outgoing and open about being a gay person was really admirable and really brave, really strong of him. The real issue was that being openly gay in South America, even at the time, was dangerous. And Daniel loved to go out to party. He would go out to gay bars, he would go out to regular bars, just go have fun with his friends. So in 2011, he went out to a party, and there were a group of guys that were kind of like neo-Nazi types, and they insulted him, and they actually even threatened to kill him. But nothing really came from this threat, and sadly this was kind of normal in Daniel's life to be kind of bullied and threatened just because of his sexual orientation. But of course this worried him and his family and his friends, and it's a very scary thing to have someone threaten you in your face. This is where the story takes a turn. On Thursday, March 1st of 2012, Daniel's mom is sleeping on her bed, and she feels Daniel jump on her. He had just recently showered, so his head is wet, and he's like shaking his head. Water's going all over her. He's like, come on mom, like it's time to get up. She's like, no, 5 more minutes, I want to sleep. And he eventually is like, come on, like it's time. Because also he had to start going to work for that weekend. So she finally laughs it off. She gets up, and he did the same thing that he always does. He leaves the house, and he always turns around and asks how he looks. And of course she goes, you look great. So he gives his mom a kiss, and then he says goodbye. And that's the last time that Daniel's mom will see him. So that was Thursday, March 1st. On Friday, March 2nd, Daniel goes to work at 2 p.m. and then he leaves at 7 p.m. Once he left, he goes straight to a cyber cafe. Cyber cafes are kind of like an older school thing, but this is where you would go to get free internet access, and you were able to use a computer as well. And he actually ends up like dozing off, and the person working at the cafe kind of like taps him and, you know, tells him it's time to go. That's when he notices that Daniel was actually drinking at the time, and the worker also sees that Daniel is looking up gay bars, and so Daniel starts opening up to him, telling him yeah, he's gay and he's part of like this relationship, but the guy is, it's always like back and forth, and it's kind of getting time for Daniel to go. So The one piece of advice that the guy gives him, since he sees that Daniel is not sober, he tells him, you know what, like, you don't look great, just go home. Don't get yourself into trouble, just go home. Daniel is listening to him, but he doesn't take his advice. He actually just says, okay, bye, good night. He leaves. We're gonna fast forward to that same day. This would be Saturday, March 3rd. At 5:30 a.m., a security guard working at the San Borja Park is walking around the premises and sees a large lump on the ground. He decides to do a little investigating, and he walks towards this big, large lump, and when he gets closer, he sees a bloody face. He sees bruises and cuts all over. He sees a huge rock by a leg, and then when the security guard lifts the rock, he sees that the leg is actually completely broken. This is when he runs to go and get a colleague. The body didn't have any ID or documents as to who this person was, so he was admitted to a hospital at 5:50 a.m. as a John Doe. When the doctors are reviewing his body and see him, they note that he had a traumatic brain injury. He had exposed fracture of the left tibiofibula. He had aspiration pneumonia, regressing rhabdomyolysis, multiple short contused and contused injuries to the face, chest, back, and extremities, meaning his fingers, legs, toes. But the most alarming thing that they see on the body is cigarette burns and swastika cuts on his chest and his torso. Eventually, they are able to contact Daniel's mother. His mom comes to the hospital and they prep her, telling her that she has to be strong. She goes into the room and she identifies her son, Daniel. The rest of the family is also called in, and they could not believe the state that Daniel was in. Daniel at the time was alive, but he was holding on by a very, very thin string. The doctors and the police suspect this to be neo-Nazi types because of the swastikas on the body and the torture and the really sadistic way that Daniel's body was left in and left for dead. So they go back to the crime scene, and what they find is a ring, a broken bottle, and they find the rock that was used to break Daniel's leg, which ended up being 18 pounds. Unfortunately, Daniel ends up dying 3 weeks later in the hospital. So now the entire country is involved in trying to find out what happened to Daniel. From what we know now, this is what happened when Daniel left the cafe. At 10 p.m. he leaves and he starts stumbling around since he was intoxicated, and he ends up at the park of San Borja. He strolls and finds himself on a park bench, and that's where he kind of like lays down and ends up falling asleep. At the same park, there was a group of 4 guys. I don't even want to say men because these are just... Anyways. Alejandro Tapi, Raul Fuentes, Fabian Mora, and Patricio Garay. They were also drinking and hanging out around the park, and they see Daniel and they begin to slap his face a couple of times to get him to wake up. Daniel does wake up, and then they tell him to leave, to go home. This was kind of like, this is our spot, like, you have to leave. Daniel does end up getting up and walks about half a block down the street and finds himself on a staircase, and he falls asleep there as well. At 10:30 p.m., Raul finds Daniel again. Raul brings Daniel back to the group of guys that were in the park, and they let Daniel hang out with them at this time. And they're all just kind of like drinking and hanging out at the park. Daniel starts chatting with Alejandro, who also has this like passion for dance and like theatrics. He even did like competitions as a Michael Jackson impersonator, and he ends up not really doing well in this path that he so desperately wanted. So he kind of like ends up getting into drugs and hanging out with like the wrong crowd and is going down a bad path. But Alejandro also loved the style of drag and would even like participate, use makeup, do his hair a certain way, and he loved being in this type of like environment. While Alejandro and Daniel are kind of like chatting it up, Patricio is calling girls that he has on his phone, trying to get them to let him come over with his friends. But really none of the girls are answering or don't want him to come over, which I don't blame them. He is something else. So, but you can tell Patricio starts getting a little bit more annoyed, a little bit like agitated. He's getting more drunk, and so is the rest of the group. At around 12:30 a.m., they decide to move to another part of the park. When they get to this other part, they're kind of still doing the same thing, just hanging out. Daniel starts to like get up and dance around, and he tries to get Alejandro to dance with him. Alejandro pushes Daniel off of him, and Patricio begins to kick Daniel in the face while he's down. Patricio was kind of like the leader of this group, and so Alejandro joins in, and they're both kicking Daniel right in the face as at this point he's unconscious, and he's bleeding everywhere in his face. He's bleeding out of his nose. He's probably broken at this time. At 1 a.m., Patricio had finished a beer bottle and decided to bash it on Daniel's head. With the broken glass, Alejandro and Patricio engraved the swastika on Daniel's body. And then Alejandro starts to urinate on Daniel, and Patricio checks to see if Daniel is still alive. And he is. Patricio, Raul, and Alejandro, they leave for a little bit. I think they were going to get more drinks, and Fabian is left with Daniel. Fabian tries to lift Daniel up, but fails, and in that attempt he loses a ring off of his finger, which is actually the ring that they find next to Daniel's body in the scene of the crime. When the other three come back, they see that Fabian is trying to lift Daniel up, and they begin to get Fabian off of Daniel, and then they punch him in the face. He's down, and then Raul comes and bashes Daniel's head into the ground. Patricio breaks another bottle on Daniel, and then Raul lifts up that 18-pound rock and throws it at Daniel. The three are all beating on him, and after they had completely just tortured him, they left him for dead, and they leave the park. Daniel at this time was still alive. At 3 a.m., Patricio and Alejandro go to the house of Catherine and Melanie Peroni, which were two sisters that they kind of had this like flirtatious relationship with, and they start yelling outside their house. They start banging the door, and they want to see them. Catherine comes outside and goes, "What are you guys doing here? It's late, you're drunk, like leave, like we don't want to see you." And her sister was staying at her grandma's house anyways. So Patricio was holding a bag that was actually Catherine's, and she had lent it to him. So he gives it back to her, but he goes, "Be careful because there's blood on it." And she's like thinking nothing of it because, oh, he's drunk again. What is he saying? But when she looks at the bag, it wasn't like wet or dried blood. It was like lumps of blood on the bag. So she sees this and she starts asking more questions. And that's when they told her that they beat this kid and broke his legs because he was gay. She thinks that they're making this up, actually, and that they're just drunk. So in the following days, Catherine mentions this to her dad one morning, since he was kind of like asking why the boys were there so late. So she tells them what they said and what she saw. And at this time, when they were searching for the perpetrators of who did this to Daniel, there were a lot of radio interviews with the investigators, and in order to get like tips and help from the public about who knew anything about this case. Catherine's dad is driving to work one day and hears all this on the radio about the case, about what happened to Daniel and where it was, what time. So this is all clicking for him, and he remembers what Catherine told him. He ends up calling the police, giving them that information. And what is also crazy is that that tip was very helpful for the police, but there were a lot of other tips. One of Alejandro's friends, they were hanging out one day, and he like pulls her aside and he's like, like be hush hush about this, but we actually killed a kid for being gay. And not only did the friend hear this, but also bystanders heard it. So not only did they do this terrible crime, but they're also like proud about it. They're telling everybody that they know about this. So they gather all this information, and they end up going to arrest Patricio, Fabian, Alejandro, and Raul. There is a long trial, but in 2013, Patricio was sentenced to life in prison. by a panel of 3 judges. Alejandro and Raul were sentenced to 15 years in prison, and Fabian was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The biggest reason that Fabian was given a lesser sentence was because his retelling of what happened that night was what really helped the police figure out what happened and who was guilty of this crime. After the sentencing, within weeks of Daniel's murder, legislators signed into law an anti-discrimination bill that had been kind of going around in Parliament for 7 years. This bill makes it a crime to discriminate against anyone based on gender, race, sexual orientation. This was done because of the public outrage that Daniel's case created. So now it's time for my thoughts. First, I want to talk about Daniel's character. For him being so openly gay, so like inspiring and so brave of him, especially because I know South America, especially like years ago, was definitely more aggressive and more violent towards individuals that had a different sexual orientation. In terms of the sisters, I definitely have some words about them. I think thinking that they were joking about something this violent was just plain dumb on their part. And also, when they're kind of like retelling the story, you can tell that they didn't really have this regret. They kind of just seemed like, yeah, this is what happened. And one of the sisters even like throughout her retelling kind of like was smiling. So that kind of freaked me out a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. To wrap it up, the boys had really no remorse for what they did to Daniel. And I wish they all would have gotten life in prison so that we never have to see their faces again. But knowing that knowing the people that they are, they'll probably get into trouble again and they'll be in prison, I'm sure, again in their life. So yeah, this was a very sad case, honestly. Just the way that they hurt Daniel was very sadistic, in my opinion. So I'm glad that they got what they deserved, and that I hope we never have to see them again. Thank you guys so much for listening to this story, and let me know if you've heard it before or if this is the first time you're hearing about it. And if you have any other information that you would love to share, I'd always welcome it and love to hear it. I recommend subscribing because I'm here for you every week with a new true crime story. I will see you guys in my next video.